So welcome to the webinar we call Minding the Business While Changing the World. We're going to cover the legal obligations of charitable board members and their various responsibilities. And many people are serving on boards of organizations because they are passionate about the cause of the organization or particular programs that that group provides to the community, but that is not enough. Being a cheerleader for the cause is great, but there are also specific legal obligations that board members must be attendant to. And if you fail to pay attention to those things, you can really jeopardize the long-term viability of the organization. So it's great to be changing the world with all kinds of great things that improve communities and help people. But if you're not minding the business of the organization, it can really jeopardize the ongoing efforts of the organization. And so we want to try to equip people with tools to do their jobs as charitable leaders in the proper way. And so one of the things, while we are the regulators of the charitable sector throughout the state, we provide oversight of that sector, but we also have family members who benefit from all the great services and programs that affect our communities every day. And so we are grateful and appreciative of the efforts that go into making our charitable world spin. It takes a lot of hard work and energy from volunteers, donors, staff members to make charities work in the way they're intended to work. And so we express our respect and our appreciation for those in the state who indeed are making it a better place to live. And so one of the ways that we try to provide support to the charitable sector is by trying to help board members know what their jobs are once they begin serving on those groups. And so we do things like these webinars on board governance. I also want to invite you to take a look at our webpage, the Attorney General's webpage at ohioattorneygeneral.gov. And if you there's a little drop down box that's on the upper left-hand portion of the front page, and you go to Services for Charities. You'll find a number of publications that we produce that are available online that we hope help point people in the right direction. Two of those publications I'm going to especially note to you. One is called A Guide for Charity Board Members. The other is called Avoiding Theft in Your Nonprofit. I think every board member of every charitable organization ought to look at those two publications at least annually. So if you're on a board, make your fellow board members aware of those. It will help point people in the proper direction. And of course, we have a nonprofit newsletter that you can subscribe to that will come by email. There's other publications there. We want to try to provide tools to help good people do good things in the right way. And so we will also go out into communities to do live training on board governance. Now, we can't go to Ashtabula County and do board governance training one group at a time up there. But if you're willing to host training in your community, that you would invite representatives from other charitable organizations to come in, we could talk about coming in and doing a live training on board governance issues. And so if you drop an email to that charitable law at Ohio Attorney General email address, we'll be happy to see if we can put something together that will help a lot of people. Many folks are surprised to learn that providing oversight of the charitable sector is the oldest responsibility of the Attorney General, and it dates back centuries, back to jolly old England. And it used to be that people would leave behind funds to assist the orphans in a village, for instance. And sometimes the trustees didn't use that money in the proper way by helping the orphans, and instead bought faster horses or chariots or suits of armor. And so in 1601, they adopted the Statute of Charitable Uses that says that the Attorney General shall have the authority to stand in the shoes of the beneficiaries and force trustees to do the proper thing. And so we continue to have that common law authority that has been explained by court decisions over the centuries about what does that mean when board members are living up to their fiduciary duties to the organization. And so we want to indeed make sure that the beneficiaries of organizations are the ones who are benefiting and that the leaders are not taking advantage and helping themselves instead. So when we look at the charitable sector in the state of Ohio, it is a vast array of all kinds of organizations, big and small. There are organizations that are multi-million-dollar organizations with thousands of employees. And then there might be very grassroots-driven organizations, like a grandmother's reading club in a local park on the Near East Side here in Columbus, where they just want a safe environment for kids to start appreciating books. They have practically zero money, no assets, certainly no staff. So the range of what organizations can look like can vary greatly, but regardless of where you might be on that line between grassroots and very sophisticated and complex, the board members of all organizations, big or small, have the exact same identical duties. Now, often people get confused about the various government entities that their charitable organization might be touching and interacting with. And there are a number of things that leaders of organizations should know about their group, kind of a basic lineup of information. Often the first step when someone is forming a new charitable organization is to incorporate. You don't have to be incorporated. There are certain benefits to being incorporated, but those kinds of filings for-profit and nonprofit organizations, anyone doing business in Ohio, are always handled through the Secretary of State's office. So if you wanted to incorporate a new charity, you would go to the Secretary of State's office, file articles of incorporation, and that will provide certain legal protections and obligations. And every 5 years, you need to file a continued existence statement with the Secretary of State's office so that they know that your group is still operational and they're not going to let anyone else make use of that name. You should know if your organization is incorporated or not. And if you don't know, you can go to the Secretary of State's office and go to their business search area, type in the name of your organization, and up will pop information. It could be that your articles have been canceled because you didn't file continued existence statements. You can generally get your articles reactivated. But also, every year, if you go in and look it up, it'll tell you what year your continued existence filing is due. So if you check every year with the Secretary of State's office, you're not going to miss that 5th year. So if you don't know the answer, check out whether your group is incorporated. The next step generally is getting an EIN from the IRS. They're the only entity that grants employee identification numbers. You can think of that kind of as a Social Security number for a business or organization. Very simple process to get an EIN for your organization. And then the next step is generally asking the IRS for tax-exempt status. Now, there are many different kinds of tax-exempt statuses. You can be tax-exempt if you are a chamber of commerce or a condo association or a credit union. But generally what we're talking about are 501c3 charities. Those are the types of groups where you can write tax-deductible contributions that you can use for your income tax filings at the end of the year. You can go to irs.gov and they will have all the information about how to apply to be treated as a tax-exempt entity. You can also double check whether your group has tax-exempt status, and if so, if you are a 501c3 or not. Every group should know the answer to that question. Now, it's possible that your group had 501c3 status, but because you failed to file the annual 990, which is the annual filing that you have to make if you're a charitable organization with the IRS. If you fail to do that 3 times, you your tax-exempt status will be automatically revoked. So you can get reinstated, but that's something that all board members should know about. So if you don't know the answer, go to irs.gov and double check to see if you are a 501c3 status and if it's still an active status. And you should also know your EIN. That is a unique identifying number that the IRS uses for all groups. So make sure you know what your EIN is as well. You can search on the IRS database of tax-exempt groups just by name, and then it'll also show the EIN that is connected to that organization if you don't happen to know your EIN. And then finally, or any Ohio charity and any other charity or entity that is soliciting Ohioans for contributions has to be registered in my office, in the State Attorney General's office. Most states in the union have some sort of charitable registration requirement. In Ohio, it's been going on since 1951. It is an online process. And so within 6 months of starting your organization or prior to soliciting, you need to do a filing in our system, and then every year you will go in and provide an update. And the filing with my office is due the same date as the filing with the IRS. So you can kind of think of it as being like we have to in our personal lives doing the state and federal income tax returns. You can think of the same thing of doing your registration filings at both the state and the federal level. You can go into my page, and we're going to touch briefly on the charitable registration system, but you can go into our research charities area and make sure that you indeed are compliant with your registration requirements. So make sure that you and your group know these very basic details about your organization. Now, far too often, we run into these kinds of situations. There are headlines in every community in Ohio, and for that matter, all across the country, where someone has taken advantage of an organization and stolen money from it or committed some sort of fraud. They misused the assets that should have gone to a charitable mission, and instead they helped themselves. The impact of these kinds of things can be quite severe. If you've ever been involved in an organization and someone has stolen from your group, you know that it is a heartbreaking thing to go through. Generally, it is someone that is very involved in the organization, often beloved, and so there's a sense of personal betrayal about this friend who has hurt this organization that everyone loves very much and devotes a lot of time and attention to. It can be embarrassing when you're a board member and this happens on your watch. It can also create some community trust issues that your group may not be able to recover from the lack of respect in the community, coupled with the financial losses that might occur. And then another alarming thing often happens when these situations happen. Often on online newspaper articles, there will be comments that are made that say, don't give your money to charities. All they want to do is line their own pockets. Just keep it yourself. And so when things like this occur and it decreases the level of trust that the community at large has in the integrity of the charitable sector, it can hurt us all. And so being on the board, one of the #1 jobs of board members is to make sure that you have policies and procedures in place that make this very difficult to happen, help prevent this sort of thing from happening, or allow it to be discovered far more quickly if it should happen. And sadly, we often find boards that are not engaged in these kinds of oversight activities that is their legal obligation to make sure are in place. Many times we find that groups select a treasurer, and they do that because they trust somebody. And trust is not an internal control. There need to be multiple people involved in the financial operations of any charity. I was elected treasurer at my church, and I wanted people to know I took the job very seriously. I would rather hurt my family's budget than to hurt my church's budget because of some mistake that I might have made. I also wanted people to know that I took the job seriously. And so we didn't have policies in place. So instead, we spent a year developing policies. What does it look like when someone is doing a responsible job of being treasurer? Well, number one, they can never do the job alone. And so we decided we wanted the council to see a report every month that had certain pieces of information in it. But before that report would go to the council each month, it would be double checked by two of a list of 5 people who would go in and do reconciliations by looking online to make sure that the information I was reporting is accurate. So many of these situations where there's been thefts could have been stopped and prevented had someone else merely taken time to reconcile the accounts and double check that the written reports that were going to the board indeed were accurate and represented what was really going on with the bottom line of the organization. I mentioned one of our publications, Avoiding Theft in Your Nonprofit. It has 20 plus suggestions of various procedures that you might want to consider adopting in your organization. Maybe they don't make sense for your organization, but maybe it would be a good thing to add on. The important thing is that you're having discussions about how to make sure that there are multiple people involved in the financial operations so that should something go wrong, it can be caught right away. And it could just be a mistake that occurs, or it could be something with a far darker intention involved. But having multiple people involved is the only way to have some sense of security that you are operating your charity with the level of care that you need to be using in how you're taking care of resources for the group. So, as I mentioned, we are the regulator of the charitable sector, and we receive complaints every day of the week from folks who have concerns about what's going on in charities throughout Ohio. We license bingo for organizations that qualify to use bingo as a fundraising concept. And so sometimes we get complaints such as, they didn't save my regular seat for me last Tuesday at the regular bingo game. Well, that obviously we're going to treat much differently than if we get a complaint from a board member who says, I have asked for the last 2 months to get financial reports and the treasurer refuses to provide them, and I am concerned about the potential misuse of funds. So we will take that complaint very seriously, and we have a staff of compliance examiners, forensic accountants, investigators, and lawyers, and we have the authority to do investigations, ask for documents, interview people, and based on what we find, the results of those activities could be quite varied. So we may find there's absolutely no truth to the underlying complaint that we got, and we will quickly close it and move on to something else. We may find that the allegation in the complaint, we couldn't find it, but what we found instead was a group that didn't have its board governance act together to the degree that it should. So we might provide technical support in helping them develop the kinds of practices and procedures that should be in place so that going forward, that group will be far better situated. We may indeed find that we have to file suit against an organization. We may file suit to recover funds that have been misused. We may file suit to close an organization or to remove certain board members from the group. And then sometimes we will work with local law enforcement on criminal charges related to what we find. So the results of our work can be quite varied. We do encourage people like all of you who have the capacity to care about the long-term viability of the charitable sector. If you see things in your community that don't add up, that don't make sense, and have concerns about what's going on in a charity, please file a complaint with us. We also want to try to stop leakage of funds from an organization sooner rather than later. So filing a complaint can help us turn off that spigot of resources that are leaking out of the organization and not helping the underlying cause, because heaven knows there are way fewer resources available to serve all the needs that are out there. So we treat charitable resources with the kind of attention that they deserve to be treated with. So if you have concerns, let us know, and it may help prevent losses from growing into much larger losses to the community and to that group. I mentioned that charities in Ohio have an obligation to register with our office. So this obligation to register in our office is for any Ohio charity. Also, any non-Ohio charity rather, that is soliciting Ohioans for anything of value. Now, there's one large category of group that doesn't have to register with us, nor does it have to register with the IRS or seek tax-exempt status from them, and that are churches, temples, synagogues, exclusively religious organizations. So they don't need to file with us, they don't need to file with the IRS, but every other type of charitable organization indeed needs to. So we have an online charitable registration system. We suggest that at least 3 people with every charity in Ohio open up their own personal account in our online system. Because when you have an account and you link yourself to a particular organization, we will send you email reminders of when filings are due. So sometimes Mrs. Smith finally retires to Florida, and if we have 2 other people getting those email notices when filings are due, then it's not as likely to fall through the cracks. It also allows everyone to see what information is being shared in their filings, and if you see something going on that's suspicious, someone is changing the address of your organization and they don't have the authority to do that, that's sometimes a sign that they're trying to take over control of a bank account. You should let us know. So when you get into the registration area, this is the Research Charities page that I mentioned earlier. You can go into this box and type the name of your organization or your EIN or the name of any charitable organization, and if they're in our database, information will pop up. You'll also note that there are a number of links on this page that take you to various watchdog groups that often evaluate charities, evaluate how they spend their money. There's a link also to GuideStar, where you can go to look at the 990s of any charitable organization, the return that they have filed with the IRS. So you'll find links on this web page. So if you type in the name of an organization and you don't find it in there, you should drop us an email or use our online complaint form, and we will try to get in touch with that organization and get them properly registered. But hopefully you type in the name of your group and they will be in our system, and up will pop a box of information. It'll include some basic demographic details about the organization. Here's an important box: is the organization's registration status current? Yes or no? Many granting organizations, foundations, United Ways, public entities that are doing contracts with charities will want to see yes there. If it says no, if you go into the system, there's a to-do page and it will tell you exactly what is due. So let's assume you got a yes, and then if there is basic fiscal information that's been shared, we will provide that as a snapshot to try to help donors make some educated decisions and ask questions about what groups they may want to support. So there are a number of statutory provisions that affect the operation of charities, and we're going to run through a number of those. The first one is the Charitable Trust Act, and that can be found at Ohio Revised Code Section 109. It defines charitable trusts, the groups that have to register with us. And the definition of a charitable trust Has nothing to do with whether you're incorporated, whether or not you have 501c3 status with the IRS. Certainly if you have 501c3 status with the IRS, you are a charitable trust. But it's defined very broadly and says if you are holding assets that are to be used for a charitable, religious, or educational purpose, and you're encouraging people to invest resources with you, you are a charitable trust and you are bound by the rules and obligations that apply to everyone else running a charity. And so if you walk like a duck and talk like a duck, we will call you a duck. And if you are collecting funds from the public and then not using them in a way that you promised to use them, that's fraud. And we will use our authority to come take action to make sure that those kinds of activities are also limited. The Trust Act allows us to do investigations and to take enforcement actions. It discusses the registration and requirements for reporting to us. It also makes us a party to certain types of transactions as well as litigation within the charitable area. The Charitable Solicitations Act is found at Ohio Revised Code Section 1716, and it applies anytime someone is asked for anything of value that's going to be used for some sort of charitable purpose. So it could be money, it could be used furniture or clothing, it could be buying an ad in a program, could be selling concession stand food at a community festival, could be bingo. So anything that you're asked to support that is alleged to create some sort of charitable outcome, then the Charitable Solicitations Act applies and you will need to register with us. And here is the shortcut to remembering things in 1716. You're not allowed to lie to raise money. So when you are taking things of value from the public, then you need to use them in the way that you promised people their funds would be used. It's a very simple lesson. There are, of course, other details in 1716 that control the activities of professional solicitors, for instance, who are hired by charitable organizations to do fundraising on their behalf. They have to be registered with us, those solicitors, and bonded. They have to make us aware of every contract they have with a charity, how much of the funds are going to be used by the solicitor for fundraising expenses, how much, what percent is going to go back to the charity. They have to provide us an annual report. And so 1716 also gives us power to do enforcement actions and to investigate items that fall in the solicitation field. Nonprofit corporation law can be found at 1702, and this includes a number of basics for how nonprofits in the state of Ohio should operate. For instance, it tells us things such as you have to have at least 3 board members. If you're going to be selling off a significant portion of your organization, it will require you to come to our office for notice and or permission for doing that. I mentioned before that we license bingo in this section, which is a way that some organizations choose to raise funds. We do bingo schools throughout the state where we train organizations on the record-keeping requirements. It's critically important if you have a bingo license that you are paying attention to record-keeping, because bingo is often an all-cash business handled by volunteers that turn over a lot. And so there are too many sad situations where people have helped themselves to bingo rather than helping the organization. So that means board members and those involved with the bingo operations must indeed be paying attention to how the funds are handled. So if you're considering bingo, check out on our webpage bingo schools and consider coming to one of those so that you can be prepared to administer the games in the way that need to be handled. 2915 also discusses raffles and games of chance that organizations, charitable organizations, can use to raise money. We get questions about raffles every day here. The important thing to know is that charitable organizations can hold raffles, but individuals and companies cannot. So I cannot decide to raffle off my husband's motorcycle to help support breast cancer research. That would be an illegal raffle. However, I could go to the Stephanie Spielman Foundation, talk with them about whether they would be interested in this concept I have, and if they approve and we work through details about how this would be handled, then it actually becomes a charity that is running the raffle rather than Beth Short. That would then be a permissible raffle. So people and companies cannot have raffles, but they can support the charitable organization in having a raffle. 2915 also carves out certain gaming type operations that charities may consider using to raise funds, for instance, casino nights. But there are very specific directions in 2915 about who's allowed to have those types of activities, how often they can be held, what kinds of activities can be used. For instance, craps and roulette are always prohibited. There are limitations on where you can have these types of activities. You cannot have them at restaurants and hotels. You can only have them at a facility owned by the charitable organization, a government entity, or a facility leased by from a veterans organization. So the important thing to know about these types of activities is that they're described in 2915. Chapter 29 is Ohio's criminal code. So this gambling statute is right in between like murder and drug trafficking, all the other ones. So if you fail to do these activities in the proper way, there could be criminal consequences. Those consequences are not going to be anything from the charitable law section. We here in the Attorney General's office don't have independent prosecutorial authority. What it means, though, is that your township police, the sheriff deputy, the local police, they are the ones that could opt to take action if you are not using these types of fundraising strategies in the proper way. So if you're going to engage in these types of activities, be sure to take a look at 2915 and make sure you're doing it in the proper way. Now, we generally talk about the fiduciary obligations of board members in 4 different ways. We talk about the duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty to maintain accounts, and the duty of compliance. And we're going to run through these and talk about, what does it look like when you're living up to your duty of care? Well, you don't have to be a lawyer, you don't have to be a CPA, you don't have to have special skills to be on a board. Regular Sue and Joe Schmoes make great board members. But what we do expect of them is that they will conduct themselves with the level of care, skill, and diligence that an ordinarily prudent person would use in handling their own family activities. So, for instance, if you would not cash out your paycheck on Friday and put the money in a paper bag to leave on your porch overnight for your son to come get by noon on Saturday, then don't do that with the money from the Booster Club's concession stand at the Friday night football game. If you wouldn't treat your own money that way, don't treat the charity's money in the same way. So, what might you be doing to make sure that you're living up to your duty of care? Well, if you're on the board and you're going to attend the board meetings, you're going to prepare in advance if you get materials and financial reports prior to the board meeting so that when you get to the board meeting, you can be a productive participant in those meetings. We expect you to actively participate. We expect you to ask questions. Ignorance is not bliss because you can be held accountable for what you do and what you fail to do. You have your own independent duty as a board member to make sure that every time you vote on something, you are satisfied that it is in the best interest of that organization. So you also can't just defer to someone else all the time. You have to ask questions until you are satisfied that it is the right thing for the organization to be doing. I mentioned earlier, job number 1, establish policies. Make sure you have internal controls, separations of duties, cash handling policies. If you have staff, then the board is going to be involved in hiring and firing the executive director, for instance. What are some policies that you're going to want to think about? Well, we're going to talk about conflict of interest in a moment. We've already talked about financial controls being critically important. So you're going to make sure that you have controls in place that make sure multiple people are involved in the operation of the financial activities. Take a look at the Avoiding Theft in your nonprofit publication that we have. Major expenditures. Maybe your organization wants to have a policy that for every expenditure over a certain amount that you have at least 3 price quotes from different vendors. Maybe if it's of an expenditure of a certain size, you want the whole board to vote on it. Now, a major expenditure for the Cleveland Clinic Foundation is going to be far different than a major expenditure for my grandmother's reading club that I referenced earlier. So it's up to the board to decide what makes sense. You can also have spending, investment, gift acceptance policies. Maybe your group doesn't want to accept the gift of cars or boats, things that come with titles, because it's imperative that if you accept those kinds of gifts that you make sure the titles are properly transferred. Maybe you don't think you have the expertise to do that, and so you're just not going to accept those kinds of gifts. Those are determinations that boards can make. If you happen to be lucky enough to have extra reserve funds, maybe the board wants to have policies on how much risk they're willing to assume in how those funds might be invested. Maybe you want to invest in Bitcoin, or maybe you don't want to invest in Bitcoin. Those are discussions that board members can have, and you can develop policies related to them. How often is the board going to meet? How many committees are there going to be? How often are they going to meet? You can have policies in place for that. And then on the federal level, it is illegal to take retaliatory action against someone who is blowing the whistle and trying to make people aware of potential fraud going on in your organization. So you need to be mindful of ensuring there are whistleblower protections in place. So how do you keep up with and know your duty of care? Well, the shortcut is to pay attention to what's going on in that organization. Duty of loyalty. We all wear many hats in life these days. We're busy people, but when you're sitting at the board table, you are wearing one hat and one hat only, and that is what is in the best interest of the organization. It cannot be, how can I use this position to generate more business for my company? It cannot be, how can I use this position to do favors for my friends or elevate my own status within the city. The only thing that can be motivating your activities and behavior as a board member is what's in the best interest of that group. And so we deal with this through conflict of interest policies. So generally, the conflict of interest policy that you may want to adopt for your group will include an annual disclosure form where it asks for various details about you. It asks perhaps where you're employed. It may ask where other people in your household are employed. It may ask other boards that you serve on, or if you have some various ownership interests. For instance, if you own all of the commercial property in any town, Ohio, and your group might be thinking of looking for new office space, that might be something that you'd want to disclose. And so what these policies are getting to is trying to identify areas where your personal life might intersect with the operational life of the charity. And when that happens, you're going to speak up and say, you know, I may have a conflict on this issue. And so what might happen is the board then discusses the issue and decides the best way to go forward. So let's say that I am on the board of an organization that wants to build a gazebo in a local park. And so the board has sent out a request for proposals to all the construction firms in town. I may own Beth's Builders, and my organization may provide a proposal to be considered for this project. So at the board meeting, when the proposals are coming up and the board's going to go through the proposals and make a determination on who gets the job or the contract, because I know I have a proposal in the pile, before they start talking about it, I'm going to say, pardon me, but I have a conflict of interest on this issue. I'm going to leave the room then, make sure that the minutes note that I left the room, and then folks that don't have a vested interest in the contract proposals that are coming in are going to make the decision about which one's in the best interest of the organization. Now, some people say, well, I'll just not vote, but that can have a chilling effect on the discussion of the remaining board members, because someone may want to say, like, that's organization, they do bad work and I don't think we should have anything to do with them. They might not voice that concern if I'm giving them the evil eye across the table. So I need to leave the room and make sure that the minutes note that I was gone. And by the way, questions and problems with conflicts of interest don't come up the next week. It's often months down the line, and it's often difficult to reconstruct your memory. So if it's in the minutes are the record of the meeting, and then there will be no questions about the fact that indeed I left the room for the discussion on this item. So the remaining board members go through the rest of the proposals, and they find that indeed my company has always been very supportive of the group. My proposal is just for cost of goods, far better than any of the other proposals. There's no question that my group does, my business does quality work. They have no other qualms about making the decision. So those board members vote, and indeed they decide to award the contract for the job to Best Builders. But that conclusion was only reached by the folks that have clean hands, so to speak, and don't have a vested interest in the outcome of that decision. So what we really like to see is the fact that you have an environment on your board where these things are routinely discussed and shared. The issue isn't that there is a conflict of interest, because unless you have people who live under rocks serving on your board, you will have conflicts that come up. The important thing is how you deal with it. So we want to see boards just having honest, candid discussions about the best way to move forward. Now, the third duty we talk about for board members is the duty to maintain accounts. We expect board members to be approving budgets, monitoring budgets. We expect them to be noting where money is coming from, how it's being used. We expect them to ask questions when they get reports showing that things are coming in below projections, for instance. And sometimes when you learn that, you have to do something to respond to those situations. So if you expected to raise $100,000 in the coming year from 2 specific fundraisers, and yet you only brought in $80,000 from those fundraisers, then the board is going to have to make a decision about what to do. It may have to decide to do a third fundraiser to make up for that gap, or they may have to cut some expenses and maybe eliminate a program or two. Those are the kinds of monitoring decisions that and issues that we expect board members to pay attention to. We also expect there to be internal controls in place. Another opportunity for me to remind you of that very important job of board members. Also, if you see costs coming in above projections routinely, ask questions about it. Maybe utility costs are higher than projected, higher than previous years, and as well as the budgeted expectations. Maybe that's because it was a really rough winter. Or maybe it's because someone is hiding how they're doing harm to your organization through those kinds of expenditure fund accounts. So ask questions and make sure you get reasonable responses. We expect you to maintain records of your organization, minutes, financial reports, and there are lots of good resources online. If you Google record retention policies for charities, often CPAs have great suggestions for how long certain documents should be kept. Some should be kept in perpetuity. So make sure you take an inventory of what kind of records you have. And because of cybersecurity issues, you'll also want to discuss how you're storing a lot of those records. Are they being stored in a way that protects the organization, protects your donors, your clients. It can be a pretty embarrassing thing. We do have a guide online for cybersecurity issues for small businesses and charities, and you would like to think that charities are not being victimized by cyber criminals, but that is not the case, sadly. So you need to make sure that you have some sound practices in mind for how you treat your online information, and that employees are being mindful of the need to protect that kind of data. Duty of compliance. We expect charitable organizations to follow the law, for one, and so there are various federal and state provisions that we'll touch on briefly. We also expect you to follow your bylaws. If your bylaws say that you're going to have a membership meeting every November, then you need to get that on the planning calendar and make sure that it happens. If it no longer makes sense to have a membership meeting every November, then you can change your bylaws. But until you do, you are legally bound to follow the bylaws, which is how you have laid out to the public how you intend to run this organization. But again, those are not carved in stone. So you can change them, and there are generally provisions in your bylaws about how to change them. But until you do, you've got to follow the bylaws, and it is a huge red flag when organizations stop following the bylaws. Chaos is the next step, inevitably. You may have agreements and contracts in place that you need to comply with. And when you are raising money, you need to use that money in the way that you told your donors you were going to. So if you're going to be raising funds to build the gazebo in the park, then that's what you need to do with it instead of supporting a cat shelter instead. So on the federal level, we've talked about the IRS and their expectations that you file an annual 990 with them. They also expect you to abide by these board governance standards. They have materials on their webpage. If you go to their Stay Exempt area at irs.gov, you'll find some really helpful materials for organizations. They've done a much better job making their information more accessible to the non-CPA audience out there. So they do have some good materials. So you're going to need to be filing your annual 990. And then I mentioned the whistleblower protection. There was one other provision in Sarbanes-Oxley, which was developed more than 10 years ago to respond to fraud within publicly traded company. There's two provisions in Sarbanes-Oxley that apply to charities. One is the whistleblower protection, and the other is if you are under federal investigation, do not destroy documents. Now, under state law, I've mentioned your registration requirements with my office. We also discussed the continued existence filing with the Secretary of State. But the other thing to be mindful of is that just because you're a charity, it doesn't mean that you're exempt from following all the other regulations and rules that affect everyone else. So if you have employees, you're going to need to be mindful of making sure that Social Security payments come out, that workers' comp and unemployment taxes are being paid. You're going to be responsible if you are working in the healthcare, for instance, in the healthcare area, to make sure that you understand what those requirements are and that you have policies in place to ensure that HIPAA and those kinds of regulations are being followed. If you deal in the food service area, there are probably local health department regulations that you're going to need to be mindful of and make sure that you have practices in place, ensuring that your organization is complying with those expectations too. So the important thing, you may not be able to do everything in one meeting and get yourself to where you feel comfortable that you're indeed paying attention to all the board governance issues, but just starting somewhere and making goals for the year perhaps would be an important first step. Many people get nervous about the financial management aspect of being a board member, but I find that many times if you can look at the financial activities of an organization in much the same way that we deal with our household resources, it kind of becomes far more manageable. And so in our household, We know generally how much is coming in for salary. We probably know how much we're going to be paying for our mortgage or rental payments, our car payments. So there are sources of revenue that are pretty predictable sometimes for charities. There are also pretty expected expenses that come up. You may have monthly rental expenses for office space. You may have staff costs, salaries, that sort of thing. So have a general idea of what those general big hitting items might be for your group. Sometimes you may have funds that can only be used for a specific thing. So for instance, raising money for the gazebo means that's what you need to use those funds for. You don't borrow Peter to pay Paul and use them instead for the rental payments for office space. Make sure you're very well aware of what restrictions are, that, you know, if you cannot live up to the restrictions that come with any particular group, a set of monies, then don't accept that gift. Sometimes organizations may have cash flow problems. Many groups get a substantial amount of their operating capital at the end of the year when people are making year-end gifts. That means that there can sometimes be some cash flow challenges that may come up in June, July, the summer months. Maybe you want to make sure that you have some sort of fundraiser to cushion that stretch in that period of time. Make sure that you can pay your bills when they come up with, or develop other sorts of expectations about how you're going to fill those cash flow needs. How are you doing matching trends of prior years? Do things seem to be on a steady course, or are there huge ups and downs? And what contributes to that? Is it something that the board wants to take a look at? Do you need to do something differently? So these are the questions that board members can be looking at without being real experts on depreciation schedules and some of the other more sophisticated things that come up with organizations. And if you need help understanding the financial statements, board members should feel free to be having discussions with your executive director or your CFO, sitting down and explaining the financial reports that you're getting, where the money comes from, where it's going, what various categories might mean. You may even want to have in your group kind of a pre-meeting board meeting to just answer questions on the financial information that may be dealt with at the upcoming board meeting. Preventing theft, that is job number one. Boards are the first line of defense in making sure that resources are being protected. The important thing to remember also is that having these processes and procedures in place, certainly it protects the organization, but it also protects the people doing those jobs. So it's far more comforting to come in as a new treasurer when there's a fully laid out process and procedure about what are the expectations, what does it look like. Now you may tweak it over time, but this helps people feel far more comfortable in stepping into these kinds of roles. And so it also, when you have procedures in place, can make it easier for continuity into the future, with other people finding that they indeed are willing to step in and service the treasurer in the future. So having processes in place is a good thing all around for everyone involved. Many times we encounter situations where board members are overly reliant on the staff people in organizations. Now, it's great to always know that you have a great executive director, that you have a great CFO, but you have to do more than just rubber stamping what they say. You need to exert some independent oversight. Many boards do this by having a finance or audit committee so that people are asking important questions, and good-hearted people who are doing the important financial jobs, if there are mistakes, they want them to be identified sooner rather than later. So asking questions and making sure that accurate information is being provided is helpful all the way around. So determining what works best for your organization is something the board can constantly talk about and revisit. Boards hire and fire the executive director. It's not the other way around. And so many times we find boards that are overly reliant on the executive director and merely rubber stamp what he or she might say. We also have situations where we have executive directors who are firing the board members, also not appropriate. So if you are engaged in a hiring process for a new executive director, you're going to want to discuss what kind of skills are needed. You're going to make sure you have a wide pool of people. You're going to want to make sure that your compensation levels are justifiable and compared to similar salaries being offered to people doing similar work with other organizations. You're going to want to think about background checks. You're going to have performance expectations and communications expectations. How often do you expect to hear from the executive director? What kinds of situations do you expect to hear right away from an executive director about? And then you're going to do evaluations of this staff person. It's also not fair to the executive director to feel like he or she has 16 different bosses, all of whom want 16 different things. So the board needs to make sure that they are operating with one voice in terms of expectations for how that executive director is to do the job. Evaluations create a great opportunity to get feedback from others about how that executive director is seen, to how is it working with that person, what do other community members think. That can be a great way to also identify how the services of your organization are viewed throughout the community. So there are any number of policies that you could consider developing within your organization. They don't all have to be done at the same time. If you don't have some of these, that's no problem. You may not even need them. You could make, for instance, developing and fine-tuning HR policies. The goal of the board for the coming year is to perhaps go in, review your HR policies, and update them, making sure that they represent the latest and greatest in terms of managing people. I always suggest that every board engage in kind of a checkup at the beginning of every new program year. Make sure everyone is aware of what the bylaws say. Make sure everyone is aware of the policies that are in place. Make sure there is a planning calendar going forward. You know, who is going to take care of doing the 990 filing and the Attorney General's filing? When will the budgeting process start? How will we make sure that we have this membership meeting in November? Are we updating our conflict of interest policies? This is a good time to do an orientation for new board members. This is a good time to get everybody centered on the same page going forward for the year. Also a great time to make sure that you have a planning calendar so that important issues don't slip through and that they are indeed going to be taken care of at the appropriate time. Maybe you want to consider getting directors and officers insurance coverage. You can talk to your insurance carrier about what risks your organization might have. It greatly depends on the kind of work that your organization does, what kinds of insurance risks exist. Making sure new board members understand what goes on in the group, how the business is recorded and reported. Maybe you want to assign a veteran board member to a new board member so that they can feel like they are able to ask questions and become engaged and be a contributing member of the board sooner rather than later. Maybe the board wants to discuss a strategic planning activity where you're looking down the road, maybe on a 3 to 5 year window about, you know, are the services you provide still needed in the community? Are other people doing it instead? Does the problem no longer exist? Those are things that board members can be asking about. And then in great organizations, the board members, in addition to evaluating their executive director, their programs, their financial status, they're also evaluating themselves. How are we as individuals and as a group doing in living up to our obligations to this organization? And by doing that, maybe you find that you want to expand the geographic representation of the board. Or maybe you find that you need to have some people with some special expertise join your board. And so that can kind of help give direction to developing leadership within the board that can be a great resource for the organization going forward. Now, the great news is that there are all kinds of resources out there to help board members in trying to address any of these issues that we have touched on today. Um, I mentioned that we have a number of materials on our webpage, so please take a look at our webpage and see if there are materials that might be helpful to your organization. And while we cannot provide legal advice to organizations, if you see something that you think would be helpful for us to develop resources on that might be your group is struggling with, maybe others are too, please drop us an email at the charitableLaw@ohioattorneygeneral.gov, because indeed we want to try to equip people to do good things the right way. Here are some of my favorite resources. If you take a look at the Better Business Bureau, they have a national program where they evaluate charities. Many of the local Better Business Bureaus also do that at the local level. If you look at the standards they use in evaluating charities to see if charities qualify for their Charity Seal program, that can provide a great tool to use in evaluating your own organization in areas that you might want to take a look at for improving. The same thing applies to the Ohio Association of Nonprofit Organizations, OANO. They have a Standards of Excellence program that organizations can elect to go through. It will look at all types of, all angles of the operations of the organization and make sure that organizations are indeed complying with best practices. Take a look at those standards of excellence and use them as a tool to evaluate your own organization and whether there are certain areas that maybe you can decide to take a more in-depth look at in a particular year and strengthen. BoardSource has a number of wonderful publications on all angles of the operation of a charity, from fundraising to volunteer recruitment and management, as well as financial management and all the board governance things we've touched on briefly today. The IRS has some very helpful materials for charitable organizations, and then the Chronicle of Philanthropy is the newspaper that covers trends and activities of the charitable sector, not only in the U.S., but internationally as well. And so there are things of interest there. There are countless books you can find at libraries and bookstores on all types of issues related to running your charities. One thing we don't do very well sometimes in the charitable community is looking at other charitable leaders and organization staff people as being resources for us. We sometimes only look at them as being competitors for funds, but talking to others in the community can be a great way to perhaps learn how they have dealt with a challenge that you might be having. And then many times it can be difficult to recruit people to serve on your board. Some people fear it's a lifetime appointment. But consider going to a local business and asking if they have an expert on a particular topic that they might loan to you. So if your board has decided you're going to fine-tune your HR policies in the coming year, consider going to one of your large employers in town and asking if someone from their HR department might be willing to help as a consultant on this project. It has a beginning and an end, which is something that people are often far more willing to engage in. So it can be a really good way to get some very high value consulting services from someone locally. And so that's kind of our basic overview of the things that board members need to be very mindful of. And again, we are very appreciative of all the work that people who are engaged with the charitable community put into making our world a better place. I'm going to take off the sound controls so that if you have questions, please feel free to ask, and we'll see if we can answer any of your questions. And also, if you want to drop us an email, we can try to answer it that way. Or you can also type your questions into the question line. So anyone have any questions? I'm not seeing any questions being typed in. So is this webinar offered at any other time? It's offered at noon on the first Wednesday of every month, but there is a pre-recorded version of this webinar that's on our webpage that you can listen to at 2 in the morning if you'd like. So it is available at people's convenience. So that was a good question. Thank you for that. Well, hearing none other, the link is, you will find it at ohioattorneygeneral.gov. Well, hearing no other questions, I appreciate the work that you're doing and I wish you nothing but success. Please check out our webpage, and if you have ideas for other services or resources that might be useful, or if you're willing to host a training in your community, please let me know. So thank you, everyone, and good luck. Bye now.
Thanks for calling back. Oh, you have some stuff. Anybody else that needs something, just. Oh, that's right.
So we could go on their website because she was talking about it last week.
Yeah, she was.
So it'd be nice if we could. Okay. There you go.